Kisukyukyit, Hokatlik kun kanus klam, Hun inik Ktunaxa, Hokakikache akam. Hello, my name is Sophie Pierre. I am Ktunaxa. I live here in the community of Akam, just outside of Cranbrook, British Columbia. The homeland of the Ktunaxa in Canada are in southeast British Columbia. And today we are in the St. Eugene Resort. This was a former residential school, and I'm here to tell you the story about that being a former residential school and my own experience here, and also, and I think more importantly, what we have done and why our people chose to do what we did with a former residential school. So a lot of the discussion these past few years has been around truth and reconciliation. Some of that has been pushed forward. The agenda has been made more aggressive because of what was discovered at the Kamloops Indian Residential School in terms of what are called unmarked graves. That is something that Indigenous people have always known. Anywhere that there's a residential school, quite frankly, anywhere that there is a mission, there are unmarked graves. That is a part of Canada's history that has not been told. And that is a part of that truth that needs to be recognized in order to move on to reconciliation. There's a very good reason why this exercise is called Truth and Reconciliation. Reconciliation without a good basis, a good understanding of why you're in reconciliation cannot happen if the truth is not told. So, this is our truth as Ktunaxa and the Shuswap Indian Band, the St. Eugene Resort, what we have here, and the former Kootenay Indian Residential School. So we'll go back in history. The Ktunaxa and Indigenous peoples that are in this particular part of Canada, our interaction with the newcomers, our contact, was very, very much later than it was, of course, in the eastern parts of Canada. So that it's a little over, well, it's just only around 200 years. And with a lot of our peoples, we still have a pretty solid tie. That thread is there, it's unbroken, back to our history, back to our own ways of being, ways of life, here as Ktunaxa, and with the other Indigenous people in this western part of North America. So the Indian Act was created in 1871, and that was, the intent of the Indian Act was pretty simple, and this is all available to any Canadian to study in the Hansards, which are the records of Parliament, and it's always been there, but it was never considered important enough to be part of Canadian history that was taught. So the intent of the Indian Act, with John A. Macdonald and others, the intent was that this was how they would see the demise of Indigenous people. There would be no more Indian question, Indian problem in Canada within a couple of generations. So we still have that Indian Act. That was created in 1871. It still applies today. And so I'm bringing this up because when I get to the part about trying to develop this property, the Indian Act has a great impact in development on Indian Reserve lands. So one of the parts of the Indian Act was around education, and there was an intent that Indian children needed to be educated in the Western way in order to this to have them become part of the Canadian body, general population, and to no more be classified or to have any identity as Indigenous people, as the original people of this land. Tremendous, tremendous effort, tremendous amount of resources that were expended to make that happen. Fortunately, it was never fully successful. The Indian residential schools are a real blot on Canadian history, and Canadians are recognizing that now. However, what was intended by having those residential schools was never fully realized. So that's good. That's the good part of that effort. So today we still have very distinct Indigenous populations with distinct cultures and languages, something that Canada is slowly becoming more aware of and is slowly starting to celebrate. Because when you think that we have languages here in Canada that are not spoken anywhere else in the world, these are Indigenous languages to Canada. My own peoples, the Ktunaxa, we have a unique language that is spoken only by Ktunaxa in Canada and the United States, because of course we have Ktunaxa people on both sides of the border. But we have a unique language that is not related to any other Indigenous language in North America or in the world. So that whole premise of having a unique language here in this valley has caused a lot of speculation about why that would be, and a lot of study. And we were fortunate to have our language studied and to have our language recorded and an actual alphabet made so that we can start writing, because we've always just had an oral traditions. Everything was handed down orally, which that's very powerful. It's those lived experiences that you pass on, and this is one of the responsibilities that people of my generation that we have. It's our responsibility to pass on all that we have been taught. Because any piece of information that is given to an individual, it's not yours to keep. What good is it if you take it to the grave with you? It's lost. Our values are that everything we're taught, it's given to us in order for us to pass on to the next generation. If we fail to do that, then it's a huge responsibility that we have dropped. And that is not something that anybody wants to be remembered for dropping their responsibilities. So we've got these, the Indian Act has been formed, and it's very clear that it's meant to do away with Indigenous populations across Canada in order to access their land and the resources. Plain and simple. There's no big question about why. And they took what they could by force. They took the rest of it through their courts, and relegated us to very small Indian reserve lands. My own reserve is 18,000 acres, and we have a registered population of about 450. And we have people that live on the reserve, just over 300 people living on the reserve right now. But another part of the Indian Act was around the education of children. And of course, the whole thing was to take the kids away from the effects of their parenting, of their parents living their traditional lifestyles with their traditional spirituality, etc. Taking children away from that and putting them in places like what this used to be, a residential school. And that started like in the late 1800s. This particular building that we're sitting in right now, that was the former Kootenai Indian Residential School. This building was, they started building this around 1910. And it was opened in 1912, and it was opened until 1970. So within that time, there were some 15,000 18,000 Indigenous children that went through, and many generations, of course, of the majority of our Ktunaxa came here to this residential school. But we also had people from the Blood Reserve, from the Peigan, We had people from the Okanagan, the children coming in from the Okanagan, and from the Shuswap area in different parts of the country. And that happened quite often throughout the province, that it was seen as, particularly if there were issues, if parents were protesting, the removal of their children, well, then the church and the government would just make sure that those children were removed even further, so that rather than going to the local, the closest residential school, they would be sent across the province. So we had those kind of situations here. So personally, I spent 9 years here. I came, and my mother brought me here. My mother brought me here when I was 6 years old. And later on in life, I was wanting to know, like, why? Why did you do that? And she said that it was better, she thought that it was better for me if she brought me here as opposed to keeping me at home and then having, it was always either the police, the Indian agent, or the priest that came. And usually it was the priest with the police to enforce the law, or the Indian agent with the police that would go and pick up kids that had not, that they felt should be at school and were not there. So she brought me here. And yeah, I mean, I knew that this place existed, of course, because my own home is just across the river. And so I always seen this place. I knew that this is where people went to school. I was here for 9 years. I did not have the experience that I know so many did in terms of the abuses, particularly the sexual abuse. There was abuse in terms of the attack on our identity. The whole premise that really, I think I probably had the hardest time in dealing with and being able to accept what had happened and then to just let it go, is this whole business about being a sinner, and that my family, everybody that I loved, we were all destined to go to hell. That's how we were brought up as kids. And so, yeah, that was a tough thing to kind of get my head around. So this place was shut down in 1970. And at that time, the 5 Indian bands in the area had been negotiating with the government about the return of this building and the lands back to the Ktunaxa and to the Shuswap Indian band. And the Oblates agreed to that. The Oblates were the order of priests that ran this place for the whole time that it was a residential school. There were 2 different orders of nuns that were here, and when I was here and when it shut down, it was the Sisters of Charity that were the sisters that provided the education and looked after the children. So we had, the Oblates had agreed, and they made a deal with the federal government that they would turn this building over with 327 acres that are part of this property to the 5 bands, or they would turn it over to the federal government, rather, if the federal government then would turn around and give it back to the 5 bands. Well, the federal government did do that, and they gave it back to us, but they gave it back to us as Indian Reserve lands, not in fee simple title that you can develop. It was as Indian Reserve, so part of the Indian Reserve system, and it still is today. So this, at first, we were all, our parents. I was just a young woman, just getting out of high school and just coming into my own and starting a family. And so the people were happy. They thought that this was a really good deal that we had got. Didn't take very long, though, to figure out that all we had was really a huge white elephant. I mean, this place takes a fortune, if you can imagine, to keep it operational. So within a couple of years, there was nothing we could do. We tried to enter into an agreement with the provincial government that it would be an institution. The provincial government would take it over and run it. But that fell through. So the building sat empty throughout the 70s, the 80s. And after 20 years, it was getting to be in pretty bad shape. In about the mid-80s, we were starting to talk about and starting to have more discussion. And a lot went on in that time, just in terms of the political developments that were going on with Indigenous people across Canada. Because 1982, we've got the repatriation of the Constitution. We have the inclusion of Section 35, etc. Like all the latest things that have gone on, the changes, the decisions in the courts. I mean, there was so much. It was a real revitalization of Indigenous people, and that included us. We recognized that if we were going to do something with this building, we had to do it ourselves, and we had to do it quickly because of the deterioration of the building. It was getting to the point where, it was, we just had to do something about it. In the mid-80s, we were starting to talk about that. At one of our band meetings, one of our elders, at that band meeting, people were talking about how the residential school system and federal policy, the Indian Act, all of the things that the burdens that we had to carry as Indigenous people were, there had so much had been lost because of that. And so Mary Paul, whose painting is in the front foyer, she told us, she said, if you think you've lost so much in that building, go back in there and pick it up. It's still there. Go back in there and pick it up. You don't pick it up, then you've really lost it. She told us this in Ktunaxa. A lot of us, unfortunately, don't speak, don't understand Ktunaxa anymore. But those of us who do didn't know what she meant. Looking at this building, how could anything be left in here other than sad memories? It took us a while before we realized what she was talking about. We started to put together the business plan and we recognized that what we needed to do was create a business. This was not going to go forward if it was still some kind of a social type enterprise. The fact of the matter is that those are dependent on government funds, and government funds, they come and go. We knew we had to create a business, and so we started to put together the business plan, and we marketed that. We went through a number of partners. Overall, just it's an interesting story, but it's a long story. It took us 10 years to do it. Eventually, though, we were able to, at the end of the day, partner with Delta Hotels. So we opened this building as a Delta Hotel, which was very favorable for us. We recognized that having a brand name was important. We are off the grid, like we're not on any major highway. We're like part of an Indian reserve. That's, there's you have to want to come here in order to find your way here. So we needed to have someone like Delta Hotels with its international marketing and international reservation systems to bring that to us, and they did. And I think that that's what has made us successful, is because we started like that and we were able to maintain that. It's the life-changing kind of decision that we made, the most important point of taking a former Indian residential school, reclaiming that, and building something out of it, something positive for future generations. We made that decision. And ironically, it was because of the restrictions of the Indian Act. The fact that this property sits on an Indian reserve that is owned by 5 Indian bands. However, we spent 2 years of what I call internal marketing with each of our communities, where we had people sitting around at the kitchen tables sitting around in band halls and band offices, at the rec center, wherever, in the bar, wherever you talk to people. And I know that it was that internal marketing, taking on and talking to our own people about what it is we're going to do, telling our own story. We didn't hire outside consultants to come in and do this for us. No, we did that ourselves. So there are many of my generation who, quite frankly, just wanted to blow the place up, knock it down. It's and because it had become really ugly by then. I mean, this is 20 years of neglect. All the windows were busted. Like it really, really looked ugly, and it looked like what it had done to us. It looked like that whole, what we got out of here. And so it was really important for us to be able to have a vision and to look at this place not as it looked physically, and not as what it had done to us in the past, but to look at it as something that we take back, we own, and we develop the way we want, tell our story the way we want to tell it, and develop that for future generations. That's the decision that our people made, and that's the thing that I am most thankful for and that I am most proud of. That is what our people did. And for me, for all of us, that is our own reconciliation, because we recognize the truth. I mean, we couldn't ignore it. We recognized the truth. We dealt with it. We created this place, and this is a symbol of reconciliation, of a people going through their own reconciliation. So that's the story of the St. Eugene Resort, the Ktunaxa Nation, Shuswap Indian Band, and also, in a sense, my own personal story.